Welcome to episode 65 of the Headspace and Timing Podcast, a show brought to you by the Change Your POV Podcast Network. On this episode, we have a conversation with Marco Bongioanni, a veteran and clinical mental health counselor who helps the veterans he works with identify parallels between their military experience and how that experience can support them in post-military life.
One of the images I like to sometimes draw too is, a map like we do in land nav in the military, right? You have your standard, paper map there that you're using to navigate from one point to another. And let's say you're looking at your map and you notice that there's supposed to be a terrain feature there, but then you pull it down and you see reality out there and there's no terrain feature there, right? Well, you would go with what's in reality, right? Because I don't want to go off of a cliff, certainly, right? Or put myself in a position where I'm just following the map blindly, right? Because the map could be wrong. You may not be in the right place, right? So life, being the reality out there, sometimes doesn't match the map, right? Of maybe where we think we're going, right? And I think particularly as we transition out of the military, we have a map in our mind of maybe where we want to go. Then reality kind of sometimes awakens us.
Welcome to the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing Podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us to learn a little bit more about veteran mental health. As you know, these next couple sessions, we're going to be recording a live in-person event. I'm here at the American Counseling Association conference in Atlanta, Georgia, and running into a lot of mental health professionals that are veterans, that work with veterans. And so following along the theme where we're talking to mental health professionals about what they're doing in transition, I have my guest today. So my guest today is Marco. Marco, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dwayne. It's really an honor to sit here with you, and like I've spoken to you already. Great to meet you in person. I've been an admirer of your work, definitely, and the things that you've done not only individually but as an agency where you're based, and a lot of the tools and things that I see, and particularly these podcasts, they're very unique, and so, yeah.
I like that. I kind of, there's a joke, I have three in the fan club, you, me, and my wife and my mom, but maybe it's starting to grow a little bit. No, but it is. It's important, but it's also important to help veterans understand the transition and what mental health is like.
Sure.
And so you are a mental health professional, and you're currently an Army reservist, and so before we get into all that, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my first name is Marco Bongioanni. I'm as you said, I work for the Department of Veterans Affairs in my civilian job at a vet center, and I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I also have another hat. I'm an Army reservist. I've been now in for about 17 years, and I command a battalion in the Army Reserves. So, as we talk, certainly these are my opinions and my personal, I think, sort of antidotes, and but I certainly love to talk about also my experiences in working primarily, probably more in the mental health capacity in the VA, and the great things that the VA does, but that many different agencies do.
So you were active duty for a period of time.
Yep.
8 or 9 years.
Yeah, I was active duty for about 9 years. I was not in the mental health field. While I was on active duty, I was a logistics officer. Now I'm a civil affairs officer in the Army Reserve, which interestingly enough, Civil Affairs is big on building relationships,
Right.
and so
It fits well with what you're doing.
Yeah, it does somewhat have a parallel, so to speak. I always like to talk about parallels and how you can find things that look like something similar to what you already know. But yeah, I kind of got into mental health. I wouldn't say necessarily on purpose. It was kind of by accident, I guess, if you could say it. While I was on active duty, going through personal challenges of my own, not only related to deployments, but just personal things going on in my life. Started to go and seek mental health services, essentially, where I was stationed at the time in Germany, and just going to the base clinic, basically. And it started to kind of get me interested, not only in a personal standpoint, but professionally, and had you asked me, 15 years ago that
Right.
I'd be doing this or sitting with you at the ACA conference right now, I'd probably tell you you're crazy. My undergraduate background was in business, so I was not someone who knew anything really about psychology from a professional standpoint, but got a lot of interest in it personally, and then just wanted to know more. And as I kind of found my transition out of the active duty Army, it just looked like a logical sort of transition for me to make, and with the blessing of the GI Bill, was able to kind of make it a reality.
It's always interesting to me. I was also in logistics, right? And a lot of times when veterans leave the service, they think they have to continue on with what they did, right? Sure. If a logistics officer for you, a lot of my platoon leaders went on to run warehouses for Walmart, or or I could have been a dispatcher for a trucking agency or something like that. It wasn't what I wanted to do when I got out, and a lot of veterans sort of think that they just have to follow into what they do.
Yeah.
But you were able to reinvent yourself essentially and start an entire second career that had nothing to do with your MOS in the military. But what parallels do you find between leadership in the military and counseling, therapy now?
Yeah, well, I think the first is what you just spoke of, those sort of hard and soft skills. The hard skills being your MOS skills, right, or your branch or whatever, your skills particularly are in the military from a functional standpoint. And then the soft ones, which are, the skills that are inherent to any member of the military, right? Your leadership skills, your ability to handle and manage under a situation that may have significant pressure or deadlines, your ability to multitask, your ability to build relationships. I mean, those are the skills that I think you can leverage doing anything in life professionally, and certainly the ones maybe to highlight also when you're going through the job application process. But from a leadership standpoint, I think, as a leader in the military, regardless if you're a junior enlisted or a senior officer, you're constantly mentoring, whether you're mentoring your peers or you're mentoring your subordinates, or sometimes even, tactfully mentoring your superiors as well.
I used to, Blake, you've heard me say this before, as Blake was my platoon leader. Yeah. I would draw an invisible line for him, for him to follow around.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And then there was a point, though, halfway through the deployment, it clicked for him, and then he became the boss. And so.
Well, I think regardless of where you are in the military, it's learning to listen and learning to take in more than sometimes you put out, right? And I think from a mentoring standpoint, you leverage those skills on a daily basis. You may not even necessarily be aware of it, but logically then to transition those skills into something professional if you desire, and not necessarily even in the mental health field, but in a field where you're just helping others. I think what's interesting about sort of the mental health field, it's sometimes called the helping field, right? Or the helpers, where healers, helpers. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of connections to just who we are in the military too. I think we are generally volunteers, obviously, and want to do something bigger than ourselves, and want to be able to contribute, and want to be able to help others, and not only when we're sent in missions around the world, but the community aspect that is very present in the military. So I think there's a lot of connections between just leadership in the military and certainly skills that you can use whether you're working as a as a therapist or a counselor, or in whatever aspect of your life takes you after you separate.
No, I really I see that. I think there's times where I'm doing the same thing I did as a platoon sergeant or a first sergeant, right? Sit down, Joe. Tell me what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Only they don't stand at parade rest anymore,
Yeah.
but it's sort of an extension of the same thing. Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned it a couple times, and I want to get into that and then bring back to this. I attended a presentation for you the other day talking about parallels, how understanding military culture and your experience in the military and drawing that into psychological
Mm-hmm.
concepts.
Yeah.
And it's very big, right? There's all these parallels, these things that mean one thing on the outside. So you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, no, I've always enjoyed, looking at parallels, I think, from a bigger picture of just, learning in life, and I think when I define a parallel, I mean something that you learn in one facet of life, right, that then can be applied elsewhere in a different way, right? And there's, constant examples of things that you can probably find on a daily basis where you learn something somewhere and now you're able to apply it somewhere else. And I think from a therapy standpoint, it's been important for me to see how I can leverage that, not only when I work with the clients that I work with, but be able to share that also with other providers, because I think you learn a tremendous amount of skills in the military and concepts and ideas, and those can be things that most service members carry with them long after they take the uniform off. And so if they already know some of those things, and they can pull from some of those skills or make connections with those skills when they go into an environment like a therapy setting, whether it's individual or group or whatever sort of setting it is, it might allow them to feel more comfortable in that setting, and allow them to feel more trusting and allow them to say, hey, I know some of this stuff already. I just maybe have to draw this parallel, right, to a concept or an idea that maybe the therapist has the professional training in, that to then be able to work it into, ultimately, hopefully, creating a better quality of life for yourself.
Right. I really look at that idea of what worked for you in the military, but we, and I say we, and you and I maybe in the same time, as we transition out of the military, we don't think it applies, mm-hmm. right? We feel like we have to know networking, we have to learn networking, but we were in the military. You knew who the cook was, the mechanic was, sure. and the S1. Yeah. You knew who you had to go to, yeah. right, to be able to get what you needed done. And you would, whatever it was, you wanted to be on the supply sergeant's good side. And so you networked when you're in the military. You had your buddy in the unit down the street that was telling you things, and you shared this peer network, but you didn't think of it as networking. Mm-hmm. So those kind of things. But when it comes to therapy, and one of the examples that you used, and I've used often, was a parallel between the concept of mindfulness. Mm-hmm. If listeners will recall, we had James Pond from Veterans Path on the show back a while back talking about mindfulness, but the idea of mindfulness and then the weapons range. Yep. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's one I frequently use, and I try and think about it myself all the time. I think regardless of what branch you were in the military and what era even you served in, at some point in time you qualified on your basic weapon, right? And so it's kind of intergenerational sort of aspect of military experience. And, regardless again of what branch you were, there's fundamentals of marksmanship, right? And one of those fundamentals is breathing, certainly. And so to connect something that is very basic, that is understood by essentially anybody who served in the military, hey, remember when you qualified on that basic weapon system of yours, and breathing was an essential part to being able to complete that task effectively. And you can see kind of the light up in someone's mind. They go, oh yeah, I remember how critical that was, and my drill sergeant or drill instructor ensured that, I understood that. And then we kind of shift from there and we say, hey, breathing was so important for that task, and breathing can also be a very important thing that you can control other parts of challenging experiences that you may have in your life, right? I mean, it's a way literally to control our bodies, right? It's almost like a braking system for our body. Or a clutch, if you think about that, right? You're able to control your body's reaction to something, and you can control your mind based off of that too. So I think it's a very simple building block, and that's I think a good example again of a parallel, that a skill someone is already going to know in the military quite well, and you just kind of have to refresh, their
Right.
mind of hey, you already know a little bit about this, right? So let's maybe try it in a different way, instead of just kind of saying, well, let's do this breathing exercise right now, and it doesn't have any necessarily context as to the effectiveness of it or what it may do or not do for you.
Yeah, I actually, and I take that and I actually use that as an example of mindfulness and being in the moment,
Yeah.
right? And I say that when you were on the range, you weren't thinking about breakfast. Like when you were on the firing line and you were qualifying with it, you weren't thinking about breakfast. You're not thinking about dinner. You are literally in the moment. You are focusing on your breathing. You're focusing on the trigger squeeze. You're focusing on everything that was around it, including your target. I mean, you were literally being mindful and present in
Sure.
that moment.
Yeah.
And even as you said, the drill sergeants, maybe they're the Zen masters, making sure that you're present in
Yeah.
that moment, right? That you're not thinking about anything else. And like you said, when I explain it in that way to veterans, they're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, no, I get that, right? And so I really like the idea that you have of very deliberately a mental health professional who may not be a veteran can learn these aspects, and not to make it fake, but to say, this is something that happened there, and then this is something that you can do here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's this idea and concept that's present. Certainly you see it in the media, you see it in society about this gap or this space between veterans and civilians, and I think part of it certainly is civilians understanding conceptually more, not only the culture of the military, but concepts of the military, right? And then especially if you're in a therapeutic sort of setting as a provider, showing competency, right? Not only in sort of the structure of the military, right? Like the ranks and the uniforms and what, the cultures of each service look like, right? But more importantly, I think showing competency in, some of the inherent sort of aspects of the military that stay with an individual long after they've separated, right? And whether that's, again, that connection right away to being on the firing line, right? Or military values, I think, is another big one that I frequently like to talk about, right? Usually, regardless of one's experience in the military, they are able to connect to whatever values their service had. There's acronyms in the Army. We have the leadership acronym. And those values, mean something to an individual long after they separate. They usually try to apply those values often in their life as well. So that's another great parallel I think that you can draw, and it's certainly informing and instructing providers that don't have that military experience, like you said, about these things, because that also gives them more credibility, I think, when they work with veterans or service members, that they've gone out and they've done the extra, sort of mile of finding out knowledge that's not just surface level, right? It gets down into the core of who that veteran or service member is.
And I think that's really, and it's part of the building trust, and it's part of understanding and things like that. And so you were a combat vet. You deployed, I think it was a couple times.
Yep, 2 times deployed to Iraq in the early stages in 2003, and then later during the surge in 2006, 2007. And I've done a few overseas duty assignments as well, and I also was deployed to Horn of Africa. So,
and I've seen this. I mean, it's a benefit being a combat veteran for other. Do you find it's a shortcut for you when you're working with veterans?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a professional doing this, if you are a veteran or certainly a combat veteran, you have to be aware. You have to certainly be present with yourself all the time. I'll see veterans who were even in the same unit I was in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not necessarily the same company-sized element, but in the same division I was in.
You
right?
like literally shared the battlefield. with them.
Exactly.
So,
And so when one of those connections happen, from a professional standpoint, you certainly do have to remain, impartial, right, to being connected on a personal level, right. But I always tell veterans, any veteran that I work with, I usually do disclose right away that I am a veteran, right. But I tell them also immediately after that doesn't mean I can fully understand all the experiences you've had in your life. We could be side by side on the battlefield and internalize an experience totally differently, just because we're two different people, right? And so even if I was the battle buddy to someone, it doesn't mean that the experience that impacted them would impact me the same exact way, just off the two different minds processing it differently. So I think I try to very frequently, establish that me being a veteran does not equal me knowing any more about you than if someone who wasn't a veteran. But I think it does allow us who are veterans and in this field to, like you said, build trust maybe a little bit faster, and certainly establish more of an environment of comfort and of a setting that is supportive. Probably we're able to do that maybe a little faster than a clinician who is not a veteran, who has no military connection, will have to probably challenge themselves much more to build that initial trust.
And it's not that it can't be done, right?
No,
it's
not at all.
I mean, it takes a little longer, but is where you talk about parallels often. I talk about paradoxes a lot.
Yep.
And the paradox of a veteran who wants to tell their story
Sure.
and at the same time can't tell their story, don't feel like they can tell their story. You and I attended a presentation today where there was a veteran who was expressing to his clinician that everybody wants to go see the war movies. Everybody wants to see and talk about heroes on the big screen. But if I talk about that same thing in the local barbecue, they're going to run away screaming and not consider me a hero. I find that when veterans come in my office and they're like, okay, you're a vet, that like the first thing you want to do when they sit down is just the worst day of their lives immediately. And I have to kind of back off and say, let's get some coping skills around this. But it's almost like a dam is breaking, because veterans want people to understand what they did without having to tell them. Yeah. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I often describe therapy as two ways. One is like a valve, right? Like a pressure valve. I usually talk to, folks who maybe were mechanics or engineers in terms that they will understand, right? So I always describe it as a hydraulic valve, right? That has a release. And therapy, if you release it all at once, it becomes unstable, right? And so, like you just mentioned, somebody who just comes in and dumps everything right away, that's not very controlled, right? And whatever we do in life, I think we always need to be from a controlled and balanced standpoint. So, a valve that's more controllable is one that you have a lever on, right? That you can release a little bit of pressure, but then also close it back up again, because you have things that you have to do in your day-to-day life, and you want to be able to leave the therapy office knowing that you can still accomplish those things. So it's a valve that has a control pressure sort of release on it that then you as the client or the veteran controls, And then I think the other image that I always like to kind of draw is like a 2-liter bottle of soda, right? If you shake it up really, really, a lot, right? And then I open it, it all comes out all over the place, right? So that's like, again, a therapy experience where everything is released too rapidly, right? Often individuals that do that then don't necessarily feel like they can come back again, right? Or there's they feel ostracized. But with that 2-liter bottle of soda, I can still shake it and release the pressure slowly, right? Very, very slowly, and then allow me to still, have the contents inside without them being spilled everywhere. So, I think it's the environment where when you go, knowing that you're in control of how to release a little bit of that pressure, I think is one that I always try and instill in the veterans that I work with, that it's not me as the therapist trying to make that pressure come out. It's you, and you control the valve, right? Or you control the ability to open that cap and let some of the gas come out literally first, right, before we go into whatever you want to go into.
It's interesting that you say control, because a lot of veterans feel like they're not in control, right? They're not in control of my emotions. Like I'm betrayed by my my body, or we think about PTSD, but just I got a job, but that job it's not fulfilling to me. I hate it, but that's what we tried to do when we were in the military, right? Sure. Was to control our actions, control the battle, whatever it was, and then we try to apply more control on the outside. And then things get out of control, and so it's important, I think, to help veterans understand that they do have the capacity to control these things. You can literally control your emotions. It literally works. I've done it. You've done it, right? But I think veterans don't understand that.
Yeah, I mean, control. I think again, if we're going to draw these parallels again back to our military experience, right? I mean, just being in control of your environment is a hugely important aspect of feeling safe and confident in what you do in the military, right? Certainly in a combat setting, right? The absence of control or the lack of it, right, is when bad things happen, right? And so, being in control, I think, is a huge aspect too that you want to draw into your life after the military as a veteran. And I always say, being in control should look like giving you still the quality of life that you want, right? Being in control should not be, I lock myself in my house and, build literally a fob around my world, right? And, secure myself because while you may feel in control, it's affecting your quality of life, certainly at that point, right? So I often, try and frame it in the aspect of how can you still be in control in environments where there are events that may be going on that you can't fully control, right? You can always control your response to things because, no one can force you to respond. We always choose ourselves on how to respond. So control is a huge aspect, though, I think, of working with any veteran, is certainly discussing that and seeing what it means to the veteran.
And that makes me think, and literally that I think parallel right there is when we were in the military, or, and obviously where you're at in the reserves, but when you go somewhere, you adapt to the operational environment, right? You do not, and this is counterinsurgency. You're a CA guy, so you know that as much as anybody else. And so we don't go in and upend the market and create an own little America wherever we go. And so we have to adapt to the operational environment. And yet when we come back here, some veterans, want people to stop shooting fireworks. We want to force the environment to conform to us rather than us doing what we did in the military. And we seem to forget that we have that ability there and we can do it here.
Yeah, I mean, again, the ability to respond is always, one that you control, right? And if I choose to respond in a way that then limits my outcomes, that may not provide the best outcome, right? But if I choose to respond in a way where I have a more desirable outcome, right, then again, maybe my ultimate quality of life is better, right? And I think you were mentioning, it came into my mind, about building trust in the military, right? I think trust takes time, right? And in the military, certainly if you do something that causes your subordinates or peers or superiors to doubt trusting you, it can be a very challenging experience then to try and rebuild that trust, right? Not only an individual, but as a couple general officers I know have always kind of stated something along the lines of you can't surge trust, right? You can't just automatic trust onto somebody, right? Because it takes a lot of time. And I think that's very similar in the therapy setting, regardless of if you're working with a veteran who is a therapist or if you're working with a civilian who hasn't served in the military. You can't just surge trust right away, nor should the therapist certainly expect that. And it's going to take some time for the veteran to feel that level of trust.
No, I think that's very important, and I see that. I mean, there is I guess I hear this anecdotally, not necessarily with clinicians that I know personally, but I'm the expert, right? I know trauma. I know, so there's a you should trust me.
Sure.
On the other side, I think that this is something that I've thought of, that especially enlisted soldiers are sort of trained to think that anybody who has a degree is the superior, right? That they're the subject matter experts, and I should just listen, not to just roll over, but when I talk to veterans that go to VA for their medications, they'll come in and tell me, they say, I hate the medications. And I said, well, why don't you tell your med management? Why don't you tell your psychiatrist about that? And they're like, well, they just told me this is what I should do. And maybe, so there's some things that in the military that they should not bring out, and that we can advocate for ourselves, and that's a lot of what I try to help veterans do.
I mean, I tell constantly to any veteran, I say, who's the best advocate for your health or for anything? It's you, right? You as an individual are going to be the best advocate. So, and some of that I think stems from just the collective culture of the military that most of us are used to, not being the individual out there that's going to make it all about them, right? But when we transition, we do have to, take some ownership in our individuality, right, and be comfortable with doing things, for ourselves and doing things because it's right for us, right, and taking, like I said, pride in what you do individually, right. That can be a significant step sometimes for transitioning, right, is going from that very we-based environment of the military to a very I-based environment of generally culturally what we see in the United States, and so that can be a big, I think, divide that you have to kind of bridge in your mind, especially if you're going to school right after you separate, right? You're in an environment where you're almost exclusively in charge of yourself, right? And no one else is going to take your tests and stuff like that, or your grades. Or if you're in the workplace where, you may be part of a team, so to speak, but it looks very different than the team that you had in the military. And so finding that thing that can drive you, or that thing that brought you the passion that maybe you had, of that sort of vocational commitment in the military, can be quite challenging sometimes.
And I hear that, and like me, like-minded individuals, that we're talking about employment, we're talking about transition, we're talking about housing, we're talking about dressing, all these things that we need to do. But for you, and definitely for me, that the mental health aspect has to be the foundation of that. Because if we can't raise our voice above a whisper or look somebody in the eye, then we're not going to be as effective as we can be in an interview or things like that.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think you have to certainly be aware of your own, prejudgments and misconceptions about things. I think there's a lot often, just in general, about the veteran community, right? Not only from a civilian standpoint, but media, from all different outlets up there, misconceptions about the veteran community in general. So we have to take some ownership ourselves in telling our stories. I'm in my graduate experience when I was in graduate school, right? That was one of the first things that kind of struck me was, okay, I have to figure out how to tell my story here, right? It's been a while since I've been back in school, and that's the first thing that happens, right? You get into class and everyone goes around and introduces themselves, and I had to make a decision kind of on the spot. Am I going to lead with the fact that I'm a veteran and I was in the military and all this, that, and the other, or am I going to focus at something else that I'm looking at in my life or did in my life? And so you have to learn how to tell your story, and that's going to look different for every person. Some people, even if they serve many years in the military, may not want to lead with that right away, and that's okay, but it's figuring out how to tell your story, because you'll get asked, right, and it'll come up. And if it's something that you haven't kind of rehearsed in your mind, it can sometimes cause a lot of challenges.
No, and definitely that. Trying to understand, how am I going to fit? What am I going to do after the military? And you talked about preconceived notions or judgments or stereotypes, right? We referred to it earlier as far as the one guy, I'm a hero if I'm up on screen.
Yeah.
But if I'm sitting next to you, everybody loves a veteran until they're sitting in the cubicle next to him, or they're sitting across the interview table, or you're at a barbecue. And if I tell you my stories, looking you in the eye, that you just saw, Chris Kyle doing on the big screen, then you'll run away screaming and think that I'm. How much do you think those stereotypes impact veterans when it comes to maybe seeking therapy?
Yeah, I think it weighs certainly significantly, because it's all present out there in the media. It's present in society. It's present in certainly the interactions that we have with peers, right, with civilians, with anyone, right, and I think it creates challenges. Again, just the general stigma of mental health, I think, is something that we have gotten certainly a little bit better at kind of dispelling that, right, and providing now resources and access to therapy, and kind of dispelling that, hey, there's nothing weak about going to get help. In fact, it shows a tremendous amount of strength. If anything, it's the more approach of strength, right, than a weakness. But there still is, I think, certainly out there, different versions of different stories, and maybe that goes back to what I was saying earlier about being able to tell your story, right? Is if you're in the community and you feel comfortable. How are you going to tell your story in the community, right? And how are you going to tell your story not only to represent yourself, but keep in mind you're representing veterans, you're representing other members of the military. When you do make the decision to speak openly about your experiences, let's say. So you certainly have a lot of responsibility on your shoulders,
right,
not only from a personal standpoint, but from representative of our group overall.
And you said it earlier about balance, right? Mm-hmm. And I truly believe in balance being necessary. You can't have zero anger because the anger is a legitimate emotion, right? You know, we respond to that, but you can't have rage, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to have balance. But then I hear that is that if I'm out in the community and I'm telling my story, I can't tell every detail, right?
Sure.
I'm not going to be telling every single minute detail, and so I have to do it in a way that conveys the understanding of what I'm trying to say, but also is protective of me.
Yeah. That
I'm not opening, these wounds and things like that.
Sure.
But I also don't wonder if it's an example piece. You had mentioned that, and very openly you said that you had accessed mental health when you were active duty.
Yeah.
And I imagine you as a commander now support, and make it, a part of your unit to say that this is an accepted thing. That's been a shift over the last 15 years.
Yeah, it has. I mean, I think you've seen, now in the active component certainly, but through all branches of leaders coming out and being much more open about saying, hey, I'm a general officer or I'm a senior non-commissioned officer, and it's okay to go get help. In fact, I go and get it myself, right? I mean, I think the military is an environment where, as a leader, you would never do something you wouldn't, tell your fellow, soldiers or Marines or sailors or airmen to do, right? And so for a leader to go out and say, hey, I go to therapy, right? Or I've been to therapy, or, I've had experiences in therapy that then, sets, I think, a real firm example for dispelling any of that stigma, certainly for your subordinates, right? And certainly also for your peers, right? And those that are out who may, for whatever reason, not be at that point yet of understanding. And I think, it doesn't have to be, therapy is a quest for knowledge, I think ultimately, right? And knowledge hopefully leads to a better quality of life for you. And knowledge is awareness, knowledge is, acceptance, knowledge can mean all sorts of things, right? But so therapy does not have to be something where you go to when you're in a crisis point, right? If you're in a crisis point, hopefully you can access something like that, right? And you can see the benefits of it. But therapy can also be a great thing just to go to sort things out in your mind, right? To have better awareness about yourself, to, explore what's going on unconsciously, right? That you're not even aware of in your life, right? And then there's all sorts of different benefits to therapy as, I think having a tool in your life to, again, release some of that pressure, right? It's not certainly the only tool, right? There's a variety of tools out there, and you and I have talked, I know, this weekend about, some of the great veteran service organizations that do things to release pressure in different ways, So therapy, I think, should be one of many different tools in your toolkit, if you think about it that way.
Yeah, and I think that and you said that quest for knowledge, in that quest for knowledge on the battlefield, right? We did ISR,
Sure.
You had scouts, right? You
Yeah.
have to figure out what is going on before you don't rush blindly in, and we don't apply that quest for knowledge. That self-knowledge is really what therapy is doing, is without awareness, we can't change something. We have these core beliefs that are inside of us. If we become aware of them and we like them, how do we sustain them? If we become aware of them and we really don't like them, I used to, the unspoken belief in my mind is all crowds are dangerous. Well, I used to really enjoy going to concerts and stuff like that.
Sure.
I don't like the belief that concerts are dangerous. Now that I'm aware of that, I can make changes to that.
Yeah.
And so this idea of a quest for knowledge, it's like scouts out,
Yeah.
right? It's like putting somebody out to,
Yeah, no, exactly
LPOP.
right. I mean, I think LPOP, exactly. And when, when I'm trying to gain information about something, I may decide to never even take any action on it, right? But I can't do anything unless I have that awareness first, right? And awareness is, again, something that could take a long time to gain awareness. And then once you have maybe some information, maybe you do decide to make a change in your life, right? Maybe you are accepting of, hey, there's something that I need to address, or there's something that I need more of in my life or less of in my life, or I have a negative influence that I need to minimize, or I need to have more of this positive influence, right? But you can't even get to that point if you don't have the awareness first, right? And awareness certainly comes, again, not only through therapy, but it can come through a variety of factors in life. We can't, the military, you can't fix what you don't know is broke, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's in another parallel, and I've used it in your presentation.
Yeah.
I appreciate that about we perform PMCS, right?
Yeah,
We perform PMCS on our gas, every other vehicle, but we don't perform preventive maintenance.
Sure.
If I were a mechanic in the motor pool, some of my clients would be coming in with class 3 leaks and everything else because they didn't perform the proper PMCS. It's always post-disaster.
Sure.
It's after the drip pan fell out of the bottom, whatever it was. And so that idea, and it's about shifting the framework. And I like that idea of that it's a quest for knowledge. It's not about sitting on the couch talking about your mother, unless your mother's the problem, and then we can talk about it. But it's about understanding why you're doing the things that you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that connection that you make, that parallel of PMCS is outstanding because it really gives you the imagery of, I don't want to be trying to address or fix something literally when all the oil is coming out of the engine, right? And the little drip, it may not even be necessarily something that's overwhelming me in life right now, right? But it's something, again, that I may want to gain some more awareness about, right? I'm going to be the operator there kind of, checking it out and seeing where that's coming from, because that might allow me to prevent then that crisis state. But certainly, sometimes we are in that crisis moment or something happens that's totally unexpected, and that's where we do have to also just, be able to know, okay, what are the resources out there that I can access if I'm in a crisis situation, right? And not only me knowing them, but also my family members or my friends knowing them, right? Or someone who's my battle buddy in the community knowing, what are those resources? So if I need to help somebody, I know, where I can refer them to or where I can take them to or where I can recommend them to go. Part of risk assessment in the military, right? I mean, we do risk assessments all the time, right? And it's important to do risk assessments in your own life too, right? And that involves not only you, but whoever's around you, right? Your family members, your significant others, your friends, your battle buddies. So,
and I, again, even that, taking that even farther, it's yes, you perform maintenance, and then catastrophes are going to happen. Everybody has, especially in the 82nd, you have a back at Bragg story. Back when I was at Bragg, but we were running a jump and transporting back and forth, and I was following one of my guys, and he pulled over on the side of the road, and he's holding his drive shaft in his hand, right? And he's just looking at me, right? And he's like, "What do I do?" And I'm like, and so there's that crisis. No matter how much you can PMCS, a crisis is going to happen. Sure. But then also knowing that, hey, there's somebody that I can call. He turned to me and said, what do I do? Oh, we're going to call this and get recovery back in and all this other stuff.
Sure.
And so that's the same thing with counseling. That's the same thing with therapy, that if you have the ability to find that person, to call out and get connected, that when a crisis happens, you have a support network. I think a lot of veterans don't think they have that anymore.
Yeah. No, I mean, and when you lose your squad or your section, your wingman, right? That can be a really difficult sort of just mental position to have to put yourself in. There is though a team that you can connect to out there in civilian life, right? Finding it can be a challenge sometimes, right? Because it's not going to look exactly the same as that team that you had in the military. They're not going to be in uniform, right? They're not going to maybe talk the same lingo. They're not going to have maybe even the same vision of life that you do. But that team in your civilian life could look like someone like your close family, right? It could also look like a veteran service organization. It could also look like something in the community that you're connected to. It could also look like maybe a spiritual or religious group that you're connected to, right? Maybe it's a pleasurable activity that you enjoy doing that you have a lot of passion with, right? It's connecting to something, again, that has that team aspect or that community aspect that I think can really benefit again, your quality of life and ultimately your sort of readjustment to the civilian world.
Yeah, and in the military, that support network was given to us, right?
Sure.
You were told when you went out, these were the call signs for battle space. This is who you call for fire. You were given all these different things. That even that infantryman, if they're stacked in Baghdad, about to kick in a door, he knows that he's got he's got everybody from a mile away to a mile above him. But when they get out of the military, we have to establish that ourselves. It's not given to us. And maybe that's a disconnect, that we don't understand that, again, we talk about control. I have the control to be able to establish whatever my support network is, whatever my call for fire, to reach out to do that.
Yeah, one of the images I like to sometimes draw too is a map like we do in land nav in the military, right? You have your standard paper map there that you're using to navigate from one point to another. And let's say you're looking at your map and you notice that there's supposed to be a terrain feature there, but then you pull it down and you see reality out there and there's no terrain feature there, right? Well, you would go with what's in reality, right? Because I don't want to go off of a cliff, certainly, right? Or put myself in a position where I'm just following the map blindly, right? Because the map could be wrong. You may not be in the right place, right? So life, being the reality out there, sometimes doesn't match the map, right? Of maybe where we think we're going, right? And I think particularly as we transition out of the military, we have a map in our mind of maybe where we want to go. Then reality kind of sometimes awakens us, right? And it looks very different.
I'm hearing another parallel. I'm sitting here grinning because it does the shoulds, right? The maps, and I've heard, no offense, Marco, the lieutenant
of course,
says,
can't spell loss without LT, right?
We should be, this isn't where we should be, right? Yeah. They're looking at the map, and this is the way it should be, and we're nowhere near where we should be.
Sure.
And so, and that's where, and I've talked before about dialectical behavior therapy, is radical acceptance, accepting reality as it is rather than what it should be.
Sure.
And if I hold on to that mental map of this is where I should be, this is the way my life should be, and I'm denying reality, that means I'm going to fall off a cliff.
Yeah, I mean, we can only be in control of the present, right? The past teaches us things, right? It's history, it provides us knowledge, but we can't change it per se, right? The future also is something that we can look forward to and provides maybe the ability for us to make change in life, but it also is, it's not clear what the future is going to be, right? So there's a little bit of anxiety there, maybe there's a little bit of fog, right? But the present is really where we can take concrete action, and I think, like we've been talking about, ultimately have control, right? And so then, take control, right? I frequently talk to veterans about, what's one thing you can do today that you can be in control of, right? And maybe it's something as simple of, I want to go home and have a steak tonight, right? Well,
or get up and walk out of this therapy
session. And it's go and do that, right? Yeah. Go and do that, and then think of another thing that you're going to do later today that you can control, right? Build that sort of repetition in your mind, just as we would do tasks in the military, repetitively to build competency. In mental health, I think it's finding something that you can build repetitively in your mind, and being in control. There are a lot of things that we can control right now. Find something and go and do that, right? And then remind yourself after about how you just did that and you were in control of it, right? Then when things approach you in life that you can't necessarily control as much of, you won't necessarily hopefully feel as overwhelmed, because you'll know that, hey, there are a lot of things that I can control. But there sometimes are things that I can't, right? But I can always control certainly the way I react to those things, right? But yeah, it's, like riding your bike, right? It's a challenge that you have to certainly take on and develop that skill. Or it's just like, when you go to basic training, your very first day, you know nothing about the military cultural experience. And by the end of your basic training, you're a trained, warrior, right? And your trust in yourself has been exponentially built over the course of relatively short amount of time in your lifespan, right? And you continue to do that throughout the military, certainly. And there's nothing that says you can't have that in your
right. And I think that's the thing, is a lot of veterans do stop that, right? It's not that it's lifelong learning, but when there is that stuck, when we don't make that transition over to life beyond the military, that the ability, the strength ability, and the adaptability, all of that ends sometimes, and it's a cage of our own construction, as we put that there.
Sure.
I think the two guys that talk in metaphor, we could be here all day.
I know.
And I don't think that we need to be. This has been great. So if somebody, if they want to maybe connect with you, do you have anything on social media or?
Like I like I said, I work for the VA. I work in the Vet Center program. I think vet centers are a fantastic resource that some veterans know a lot about, others maybe not as much. Vet centers are located all across the country and are very easy to access. Specifically work with combat veterans and family members and veterans that have experienced military sexual trauma. I think the vet center culture is one that's very much built of veterans helping other veterans, and so you'll find a lot of counselors in vet centers are veterans themselves, and that can sometimes provide an environment that's just much more inviting maybe initially, right? But certainly there are phenomenal services that are available not only in the VA, but also in many different community agencies that are out there. And I know one of which you're part of, Dwayne. And I think it's a team, right? Just like in the military, if you're doing an operation, you have to have your joint partners there, right? You can't just do an army fight alone. And very similar in mental health. It has to be a team effort. And that's not just the VA, certainly, but it's all the different community agencies that are out there, all the different veteran service organizations, right? All the different things that aren't even necessarily connected with veterans or the military, but are just present in the community, right? And so, that's the team that I think needs to be there, and knowing that accessing that team can maybe have some challenges. There are definitely a lot of barriers out there that I know you've talked many different times about in not only your podcast but in other forums. But I guess if I were to summarize it, my own experience was one of talking to another veteran first, right? Being that the first sort of intake, right? Of, hey, what was your experience like? Tell me how this worked, and which is very similar to how I think we learn things in the military, right? We're shown by somebody who has knowledge already, right? And then we learn by doing. And then you repeat that task again and again and again until you become proficient. So then you can teach someone else.
You give it along the other side.
Yeah.
Right, so I'm definitely going to make sure that the link to the vet centers is in, and listeners can go to the show notes and type in their zip code, and it's going to show this. I absolutely, not being in the VA, so I don't have to give the caveats, but I'm a huge proponent of the vet centers. They're outpatient mental health counseling clinics. They are very much comfortable. Those listeners who had listened to Dr. Alicia Karaquiri in the National Academy's surveys identified that the vet centers are really first in class when it comes to mental health, providing mental health in the VA system. That many veterans feel more comfortable in the vet centers. And I think you and I had talked about this briefly, and I know my colleagues at the vet center, they're frustrated because veterans don't know about the vet center. And so learning even more about where the local vet center is and what they do, it's critical.
Yeah. Well, I think it's again, knowledge of what's out there in your community. And, when you separate, you may not separate exactly where you're going to end up living, right? And so having knowledge of what's local to you, and that's not just VA resources, that's everything that's out there, I think is a real important piece to transition, and unfortunately you don't really get that picture when you transition out of active duty, because they give you a very wide scope of what's available out there, and frankly your mind generally is elsewhere when you're going through the process of separating. And so
it's not at your feet, it's on the horizon.
Yeah, exactly. And so you may even have a tool that maybe you were introduced to, but it doesn't necessarily come at the forefront of your mind. So but knowing what's out there in the local community is definitely, I think, a huge importance when you're transitioning, and vet centers can certainly be one of those places.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk to us.
Sure. No, thanks, Darren. Really appreciate the time too, and it's an honor to have done this with you too. I again really admire your work and look forward to continuing to follow your podcast.
Well, absolutely, and it's we're all in this together.
Yeah. Cool.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. There was a lot of great stuff in that conversation. At the beginning, I cut out a snippet of the conversation that gives a great nugget of information about their subject. Well, with Marco, I had a hard time picking out just one. He made so many great points that choosing which one to highlight was challenging. The parallels were great. It's super effective in helping veterans understand more about what they're experiencing, and helpful for those mental health providers who work with veterans but aren't veterans themselves, understand more about the veteran mindset. Whether it was explaining mindfulness by being at the firing range, the parallel of the map not matching reality, building your team after the military, networking, preventive maintenance, all were really effective in describing mental health interventions and therapy. I also really appreciated how he talked about therapy being a quest for knowledge rather than just someone fixing what's broken. There are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to whether or not meeting with a mental health provider is necessary, and whether it's necessary not only in imminently crisis situations, or, more likely, after a crisis has occurred. Looking at therapy as a knowledge and understanding-seeking exercise, rather than just sitting around talking about your feelings, can go a long way towards reducing the stigma about it. And the idea of needing to shift from we to I after the military. Hard to hear, I know, for a lot of veterans. Thinking of self is extremely challenging for a lot of veterans, this one included. That doesn't mean that we have to become self-absorbed jerks that don't care about anyone else, but it does mean that we have to pay attention to ourselves as much as we do for other people. And finally, checking out the Vet Center program through the VA. It's a great program that's super effective but doesn't get a lot of publicity. It's not through lack of trying, though, but rather just the sheer amount of information that's out there. Don't forget, in the last couple of months, I've been giving away free books to organizations that partner directly with veterans. Last week, we heard from our June partner, Inner Resource Psychotherapy. July's partner is Operation TBI Freedom, a nonprofit in Colorado Springs that provides peer support and case management with veterans who have experienced traumatic brain injury. If you want to learn more about the organization, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/organization. If you want to support their work with veterans, head on over to veteranmentalhealth.com/combat vet book and pick up a copy. And if you have an Echo device, we're on Amazon Alexa as well. Just go to veteranmentalhealth.com/Alexa to add the update to your flash briefing, and you'll get daily updates about veteran mental health and wellness. Make sure to tune in next week. We have a great guest who's doing some awesome stuff when it comes to veteran mental health. I have a conversation with Ken Falk, the co-founder of Boulder Crest Retreat, about his latest book, Struggle Well, and the concept of post-traumatic growth. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, stay focused and be well. I'd like to thank the Change Your POV Podcast Network for hosting this show and highlighting the critical importance of veteran mental health. We want to hear from you. You can reach out to me via email at dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com. You can find me at Twitter @TheCounselingVet, or head on over to Facebook and look for the Change Your POV Squad. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. Sign up for updates on either or both so you don't miss another episode. While you're at it, check out the other great shows on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. The show about remembering our military history and reviving our warrior spirit, changing hearts and minds. The show about outdoor activities that us veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods. The show that helps us get going at the beginning of the week, Motivation Monday. And Attack Fridays, the show that brings you actionable tips, tricks, and coachable knowledge to help you make the best of your transition. While you're checking out the other shows, drop us a review in iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're listening to. The reviews really help spread the word about what we're doing. If you're looking for the total package for all the information you need to live the life you want after leaving the military, you found it. If you know of a buddy who's looking for the same info, share it with them so they can find it too. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use his track, Not Alone, from his amazing album, Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is somebody who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get the album by going to therealdoctodd.com. Check it out, because remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I hurt each time I wait, but with you I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
Yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision Lasix, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I hurt each time I wake, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.